we are very glad to present you this report on which the whole team has been working a lot. Want notably to recognize the role of Yann, Johannes, and Clara, who've been leading the work to produce this report. And it's great to see today a combination of members of the DDP community. So I see many of the members of the network will say a few words a bit later. So that's great, but want already to recognize that obviously, as usual with the DDP, nothing would have been possible without the contribution of our in-country partner. And it's great to see also friends of the DDP who can attend this session and enter in the discussion about this report. So the way we've thought about this session is first to give you a presentation. So just to say that the report is live now, so it's on our website, and we'll provide, I guess we can provide in the chat already a link, and we'll provide it at the end of the meeting. So we'll present you highlights of the report, not going into all the details because that's a very rich report, and obviously we don't want just to make a too long presentation, because we also want, in a second moment after the presentation, to leave some time for a broader discussion about how the type of insights that is emerging from this report can be useful going forward in the discussion that are happening and will be happening regarding the ambition discussion. So that's kind of divided in two parts. So going straight into the presentation of this report, and Anna, please, next slide. Going next slide. Perfect, thanks. So here, not spending too much time here, because I get that all of you know very well what the DDP, Deep Decarbonization Pathway Initiative is, but just stressing again that the key principles on which we've been working with our partners since 2013, and these are intangible principles, is that we are guided by the principles of being country-driven, country-led, and country-owned. So all the analyses that we'll present in this report that derive some cross-cutting message, I will come back to that later, are grounded on the work that is done by the in-country partners, and more specifically, in the context of this report, we build on analyses that have been done in 10 countries. The list is there, and many of the country representatives are here, which represent a large share of the population, a large share of emission, but also a diversity of country circumstances. And that's what allows us to derive some messages that obviously are valid for these countries, but also have a validity that goes beyond what these specific countries can tell, and that we hope can be useful more broadly for the discussion. Next slide, please. So this report, more specifically, it's indeed a global report anchored in national realities, and it builds on detailed scenarios that have been developed for the 10 countries that we've covered by our country partners. Here, I want to stress that, again, along the principles of the DDP, our work is done by in-country partners who are independent from their government, but that are closely connected to them. So the policy relevance and the scientific legitimacy of our work really comes from who these in-country DDP partners are, and the fact that the analyses they put forward capture both best available scientific methods and knowledge, but also a deep understanding of their country circumstances. And notably, one thing that I want to highlight here is that a specific effort that we've always done, but that we've tried to push further with this round of work in the DDP, is a detailed accounting not only on the emission dimension, the climate dimension, but also a deep accounting on the socio-economic dimension that are core to each country's circumstances. And that goes beyond the standard approach of looking at GDP or GDP per capita as a measure or as a proxy for this, but also trying to integrate as much as possible, depending on the country's circumstances and the analytical capacity, but as much as possible of the relevant socio-economic dimensions And I mean, among those issues like inequalities, household income, access to basic services, urbanization, labor-related issues, food security, local pollution, etc. So it's not that each of these dimensions are systematically covered in all the country studies, but each country analysis takes into account those of those dimensions that are most critical to the relevance of the analysis. And that's something that is extremely important when interpreting the work that we are doing and the analysis that we put forward, is that they really integrate the achievement of these key socioeconomic priorities of the analysis. Based on that, the analysis explores net zero by 2050, 2070, and here stressing that this range also reflects the fact that countries are different, they have different circumstances, they will have different carbon neutrality dates, but for most of the countries that we are covering, there is an official target to reach carbon neutrality by 2050 or 2060 or 2070, and that the analysis that we are presenting here actually captures this specificity. So basically, the work that we build our analysis on integrates both the requirements, the challenge of reaching this long-term demanding goal, together with the achievement of socioeconomic priorities. Here, what we will not do is to discuss in detail the in-country details, because that's available, and you will find in the report some references to the work, the detailed country work that we are doing. What we are doing in this report is to derive some cross-country insights that can emerge from this analysis. Next slide, please, Anna. Thank you. So the key features of this report, and to give you the basic spirit, the message that we derive from looking at this 10-country work is that we see that it is possible. It is still possible to reach the ambitious goal of the Paris Agreement, and it's possible to do it in a way that is consistent with the achievement of socioeconomic priorities. But the core question that this report will focus on is not whether it's possible or not, it's to try to inform how to make it happen. And these are the two main streams of work that we'll be focusing on, one informing on long-term transformations, and second on immediate actions. We'll come back to that later on, but that's kind of the core of the analysis that we are doing. Just want to flag also that there is an underlying necessary condition that is sometimes mentioned explicitly, is sometimes a bit implicit in all the analysis that we are doing, is the core role played by international cooperation to promote this innovative solution. And just flagging here, notably, and maybe sending you back to the report we published last year on the topic, the annual report on 2023 was exactly on this specific question. So it's not absent from this report. It's kind of more or less everywhere in the report that we published this year, but that's kind of an important underlying condition that I wanted to flag up front as well. And so this report, very practically, it's structured in two parts. One that looks at long-term transformations in these national pathways to net zero, and the second that looks at immediate actions in national pathways to net zero. And the two obviously trying to look at the same transformations. I will not go in the details of what we are doing, and we'll come back to that at the end, but just want to recognize that the purpose of this report is not to explore consistently all the aspects of national pathways to net zero, but we've selected those where we feel that we have something relevant and maybe something new to bring with our specific approach to the analysis. So that's kind of a selection of where we feel that we can make a real contribution. But you will see later, we have a poll where we will ask you whether our judgment about whether our inputs are new or not is whether you share that with us. One word before going into illustrating this is to explain the link between these high-level messages, cross-cutting messages that we will present you, and the country studies. And there are two main ways that we will, again, illustrate in our presentation with two examples about how we use the country studies to inform these cross-cutting messages. One can be by conducting some cross-country analysis. So we look at specific indicators across countries, and we compare the trends. The comparison doesn't mean that we want to highlight the need for each country to do the same thing. Again, as I mentioned, each country and each country team was free to design their scenarios according to what they feel was relevant, but it's rather to analyze ex post whether there are some commonalities or highlight some of the differences that may emerge from this comparison across country. A second use of country study is sometimes we felt useful to dive deeper into country case studies. So basically having a more in-depth analysis of specific aspects of the transformation in one or several countries as a way to illustrate and support a high-level message. And so what you will find in the report is a series of messages that are organized around these 8 aspects, and each of these messages being supported by a combination of cross-country analysis and country case studies. And with that, the idea that we have is to highlight you 2 of these messages, and for that I will hand over to Yann, who's been coordinating the work on these 2 messages. Go ahead.
Thank you, Henry. Yeah, so an important lesson regarding the first part of the report on the long-term transformation is about the use of fossil fuel. I will use that as an example of a systematic cross-country analysis of net zero pathways. So the main lessons here is that net zero pathway necessitate a relentless decrease in the direct use of fossil fuel, aligning with domestic socio-economic priorities. And to understand that main lessons, we have used one cross-country indicator that you can see here with that graph and that figure that shows the share of fossil fuel in final energy consumptions. From that, we have tried to analyze those numbers and understand the key commonalities and differences that you can see on the right side, which are that energy consumption in developing nations is projected in all cases to rise to ensure energy access for all. Second, when you look back to the graph, you can see that countries such as Argentina, China, Indonesia, Mexico, and US could reduce their share of fossil fuel from about 70% in 2020 to down to 30% or less in 2050. And you can also identify that there are other countries that have different trends, but that follow their national circumstances. So in the report, you can find explanation that highlight why there is some differences between the countries. But in general, what we can see is this relentless decrease of fossil fuel. A third or last point in the key figures are that the volume of fossil fuel use decreases in aggregate terms. So in total, it reduces by 30% by 2050. And that we noticed that beyond 2050 and towards 2070, there is an acceleration in the transition away from fossil fuel. Next slide, please. A second part of this message is about what enables that relentless reduction of fossil fuel. And one interesting part coming from the net zero pathway is that these trends particularly require country-driven shifts in infrastructure and organization to reduce energy needs for development objectives. To illustrate that, sometimes we have used some sectoral examples. So here you can see a sectoral example from the passenger transport sector. And one of the indicators we have found interesting to talk about that part of the message is the per capita mobility. So here what we can see is that there is in the DDS a more moderated increase in the per capita mobility compared to CPS, but that enable the same needs of the population, that enables to reach the same needs of the population. And this is due mostly to transformations that support a shift away from the current dependencies on cars and energy-intensive mobility systems that you can see on the right side of this slide. What was also quite interesting in that analysis and in that typical example is that the teams analyzed that it was also a structural change that at the same time enabled to align at best climate objectives and sustainable development goals, as for example here, this can reduce congestion and the lost time in travel, so the travel time, lower the mobility cost, improve the road safety, and provide more spaces for living in cities. And now I will use another part of the report. If you remember the introduction of Henri, the second part of the report is to focus on immediate action. So an important lesson we wanted to highlight on immediate action is the lessons on immediate action to enable long-term emission reductions. We will use it as an example, or I will use it as an example to show you the richness of these individual country-specific case studies. So, but first of all, on the main lessons and the main message here, the main lesson coming from Pathways looking at 2050 and 2070 horizon is that actually they are able to consider some immediate actions to take, which are essential for the long-term and deeper emission reductions. This question of temporality is critical and difficult to consider without a long-term perspective. So this work enables, among others, to understand the source of inertia who need to change to reach net zero. For example, short-term action that may create new carbon lock-ins in the future should be avoided. And in contrast, short-term action that address the various source of inertias associated with these structural changes and offer these potential long-term emission reductions should be prioritized. And what we analyze in that work is that we identify three main sources of inertia that relates to infrastructure and technology, governance and institutions, and lifestyles and behavior changes. And the case studies provide very relevant and interesting detailed elements to illustrate those structural change in the different sectors and characterize country-specific actions that address certain source of inertia. I will give you some example of the richness of this case study. So here, highlighting three case studies we have on infrastructure and technology. For example, there is a China case study that is about the short-term decisions about the building of new coal power plants, explaining the complexity around such choices. On one hand, the analysis shows that this will increase the cost of the transition with additional stranded assets to continue building new coal power plants. On the other hand, the case study shows that the rapid growth in electricity demand in the country is outpacing the renewable capacity, that the power system is currently lacking of flexible assets, and that the north of the country is currently stuck in a system that is using a heat network based on coal. So these elements are critical to understand if we want to unlock future decisions and if we want to drive that radical change on the power system. Another good example and case study is the Senegalese one that is about short-term decisions on the building of gas and renewable power capacity. This case study perfectly illustrates the state of the policy discussions and the tensions that could happen between the socio-economic objectives of the country and the climate objectives. So here in that case study, it develops around what are the conditions for a balanced combination of gas and renewables that could be compatible with both achieving net zero and development goals such as enabling the universal access to electricity. A third example on infrastructure and technology is the US case that is on developing new technologies for net zero, such as the CCUS. In that example, in that case study, you will find some concrete policies implemented in the US to support research and development, pilot projects, and the development of a commercial future market for CCS use. You will find, for example, that the latest Inflation Reduction Act is providing an incentive to support the deployment of CCS technologies under the condition that this solution can cost less than $85 per ton of CO2 captured. Next slide, please. And I will now just illustrate two other case studies that reveals or are good to show two others inertia that are one on governance and institutions and another from Nigeria and another one that will be about lifestyles and behavior. The Nigerian case study is about the short-term actions on the governance and institutional rules to develop rail freight and limit the dependence on the road. It is a critical component of the long-term decarbonization strategy that you can read further and has been published by our Nigerian colleagues. It illustrates this case, the inertia that is related to the governance reforms. And it shows that, for example, the central government should play a more important role in the planning process. And in the planning process, as there is some country-specific challenges like the coordination between central and regional government, or also the regional security concerns in the northeast of the country. A second aspect of this case study is the aspect around the participation of external and private actors. So how to support international private investment in the country to get technical innovations and foreign investments, and at the same time make sure that there is also obligations related to the development of the national private sectors and the local economy and jobs. So it shows these participation of the private sectors as a critical enablers, and also the role that other actors and the civil society, including the Nigeria indigenous people, should play in the discussions and in the governance of planning such transformation and infrastructure. Last slide, please. And just to finish and conclude on a very important source of inertia for long-term deep decarbonizations is lifestyle and behavior. And in that, to illustrate that typical source of inertia, our Indian colleague developed a case study that shows that short-term decisions are important to change lifestyles and behaviors. So it presents the challenges of introducing demand-side policies that can lower the pressure on the rapid growth in the use of energy, as for example in the power systems, and it develops and present the initiative Lifestyle for Environment that has been launched by Prime Minister Modi at COP26, and that is included in the Indian NDC as a good example to foster in other countries. And now I will pass the floor back to you, Henri, to conclude.
Thank you, Yann. And yeah, the purpose of these two messages, beyond the relevance of them, is also to illustrate the type of information that you can find and the way the argumentation is structured in the report.